So, Boker Tov, today's Daf Yomi is Bava Metzia Kuf Gimel, and we're going to start on Kuf Beis. I'm a Beis, around 10 lines from the bottom. Daf Yomi is dedicated for a Shmira for the Chayalim, Hatzalah for the Shvuyim, and a Yeshua for Am Yisrael. As we stand 2 days before Matan Torah, and we're readying ourselves to receive the Torah again, to recreate that moment where we received the Torah at Sinai. So we're going to start Bami Nemi Rabbi Yanai. They asked Rabbi Yanai the following question. I'm sure this was a common scenario throughout history. Sochor Omer Natati. The tenant says, I paid. Ma'askir Omer Lo Natalti. The landlord says, I never got the money. Mila Havi Raya. Who has to bring the proof? So it says the Gemara Amos. Well, when did it take place? Ibitol Mano. If it's within the month. Tanina. We learned this in a brisa. Ila Achar's Mano. If it's after the time we're supposed to pay, Tanina, we also learned that. Tanya, we learned in the Brisa. Mesa av b'toch shoshim yom. Now this talks about a pidyon ben, redemption of the firstborn son. So we learned about this, that if the father, the mitzvah is on the father. The first mitzvah is on the father. Let's say the father dies within 30 days, so the child was not, we don't know if the child was redeemed or not. So within the 30 days, he hasn't paid a Kohen yet because the presumptive status is you don't pay in advance. Unless the boy brings a proof that he was redeemed. After 30 days, we assume that he was redeemed until they tell him until Rashi says the neighbors come over to him and said, your father told us before he died that you were never redeemed. So the neighbors tell him, we assume he was redeemed unless he's told he wasn't redeemed. So presumption is within the time of the month, we would assume that the landlord is right. After the month, we assume the tenant is right. So that's how you have to do the proofs. No, we're talking about a case. Talking about a case where it's the final day, the day you're supposed to pay. Now, does the person pay that day, generally speaking, or does he pay the next day? Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan says, Tanisua. Rabbi Yochanan says, well, this too, we learned in a Mishnah. Going to God will and get to this Mishnah later on in Hamikabel Sadeh, in the next chapter, in the 9th chapter. Where it says, that let's say you're a hired worker and the obligation is on the employer to pay. Then nishba v'notel, then the employee, the worker, could take an oath that he wasn't paid and collect the money. Typically speaking, we say that the obligation to. Typically speaking, we could say that the obligation, that the way it works is you take an oath and you're exempt from paying. But here in this case, because we say the employer is so busy, the employee has the right, if he's due the money, to take an oath and collect the money. So we say in that case, Sachir, the worker, who the Ramu Rabbanan Shvualei, the worker, the rabbis say he gets to take an oath and collect the money. Mishum the Baal Bayis Tarid B'Po'olav, because the employer is very busy, doesn't remember if he paid him. But in this case, Sochar Mehem B'Shvua. But in this case, the tenant will be believed with an oath to say that he paid the money. So the landlord would say, take an oath. The tenant would take an oath that he paid the money, and then the landlord would be out of luck. So that would be the case in this case. Amar Rav Nachman. Hi man, the Ogreway Besa. So Rava says, Amar Rav Nachman. Hi man, the Ogreway Besa. Chavre, somebody who rents out a house to his friend Eser Shanim for 10 years because of Vaishtara. And he wrote him a note saying that I'm renting you this house for 10 years. But I'm away. And afterwards he says to him, the Kitas Chamesh Shanin. And he says to him, you've already lived in it for 5 years. Mehemen, we believe the landlord that this person is lived in it for 5 years. And Rashi says the presumption is that the owner of the land is considered to have the presumptive status of the chazaka, that it's his. And so therefore, if it's a doubt, the other person has to bring a proof. So he says to Ravina, you want to argue that? Let's say I lent you 100 zuz with a contract. And the guy says, listen, I paid you half of it. Will we believe the guy who claims he paid half? We wouldn't know. You have to bring a proof that he's paid it. So two cases are not the same. In that case, no purpose of the contract is to be able to collect the money. If he indeed had paid it, he should have wrote it down on the contract, or else he should have written it, gotten a receipt. But in this case, the landlord could say, or the owner of the property would say, the reason why I wrote for you a shtara, because the only reason why I want you a contract is I didn't want you to claim that it was yours from the beginning. I wanted to prove that it was mine. So that's the only reason why I wrote the contract. So Amar Rav Nachman, Sho Adam Betuvo La'olam. A person is allowed to borrow something betuvo forever. What does it mean betuvo? Rashi says it means, let's say you see your friend has a object, and you say, lend it to me betuvo, lend it to me like as a favor. And basically, can I always use this? He says, yeah, sure, I got my lawnmower, you could always use it. And then he can borrow it forever as long as it's capable of doing work. Meaning to say, what does this expression betuvo mean? It means that as long as it's in good condition, you could use it. And even if he returns it, he could come and take it back. So basically, the word betuvo is implying that he can use it as long as it's in its good state. That's how Rashi explains it. The Rabbeinu Hanano and Arach say that the tuvo means as a way of expressing gratitude, meaning to say that the borrower will always be grateful to it. The Ritva gives another explanation that the borrower did on a favor for the lender prior to that, and now he says, in return for my favor, give me your favor. So basically, this is something he's always borrowing for him, so he can do that. And Amar Rav Mari Bara to Shmuel. So Rav Mari, who is the son of the daughter of Shmuel, explained. Wait 1 second. Why is Rav Mari the son of the daughter of Shmuel? So we know that this is the idea that the daughter of Shmuel is kidnapped, and then she conceived while she was in captivity, and then her captor eventually converted and married her. So since he was conceived, Ramari was conceived before his father converted, therefore he's called the son of the daughter of Shmuel. So he says, "Who the kani minei?" It says, where does he always have the right to go and borrow it? Where he did an actual formal kinyan, a formal acknowledgement of the relationship. Namar of Mari Braid Rav Ashi. But this agreement does not include the broken pieces. So when it breaks or when it wears down, you have to return it. So if a person says to his friend, let me borrow a hoe to hoe out this orchard, then he could hoe out this orchard. If he just said Pardisa, if he said an orchard, Rafik Bey called Pardisa Debai, then he could basically use it on any orchard that he wants. Pardise, if he does orchards, Rafik Vazal called Pardise Islay. Then he could do as many orchards as he wants. And then return it when it breaks down, return the broken pieces. He says, let me borrow this specific well, Vinafwa, and then that well breaks, so Baniwa. Then he's not allowed to rebuild it. But if he says Garguta a well, Vinafwa, and it falls Baniwa, then he can rebuild it. And also Be Garguta, if he says wells, then Kari Va'ozol Kama Garguta, he can dig up several different things, Ba'are Adam Isramile, until he finds the water of a tzarcha miknei, but he has to do a formal kinyan with him as a result. Okay, up says the Mishnah. Hamaskir bayis l'chavero. So let's say a person rents out a house to his friend. V'nafal, and the house falls down. Chayav ha'midu bayis. He has to put up a new house. If it was a small house, well, yes, and gadol. He can't make it big. Some people don't want a big house. They have extra electric bills. Let's say it was gadol. Let's say it was big. Well, yes, and katan. Can't make it small. Echad, if he had a one-room house, well, yes, and shnayim. You can't give him two rooms. Sometimes you only want one room. Shnayim, if he had two rooms, well, yes, and echad. You can't make one. Well, you can't say, I'm going to make you a house with less windows. Well, Yosef Alim, we can't give him more windows. Only dash name, unless both of them agree. Hey, what's the scenario? Ida Amrway. Bias Zenafal. If you want to say this house, bias Ze, then if he says, rent me out this house, well, if that's the case, Nafal, also way, once it falls, he lost his house. Ida Amrway bias Stam, if you just said a house, which means echad amayol yasen hushnayim. Well, then why can't he make him two? Or katan amayol yasen gadol. Why can't he make him? Why if it's one? Why can't he make him two? And if it's small, why can't he make it? Why can't he make it bigger? Since he just said one house? Why does it have to? Why can't it mean any house that he wants? So that's the Gemara's question. So Gemara says, Amar Reish Lakish, the Amar Bayish Ani Maskir Chamidas Arko Kachatach. So Reish Lakish says, no, he says the house that I rent to you will have this types of measurements. Well, the Gemara says, well, obviously that's the case. Yachim Ayla Memra. Elo Kiyatsa Rabin Amar Reish Lakish. So when Rabin came, he explained Reish Lakish. He says, the Amar Bayis Kazani Maskir Ocha. He says, I'm going to rent you a house like this one. He points to this house. Agati Ayla Memra. So what's the Chiddush? And Gemara says, no, that the house was on the banks of the river. And he says, I'm going to get you a house like this. So Mao the Pami might have thought, Micah said, when he says, I'm going to get you a house like this, he means the Kaya Aguda Dinara. He might have thought he meant he's going to get you waterfront property, but not the exact requirements. So we're saying, no, that he needs to get him the exact requirements. And so what about the waterfront property? Does he have to get him the waterfront property if he uses that language? So that's a dispute amongst the Rishonim. Hadranolach, Hashoel, Hadranolach, Hashoel. We will return to this beautiful chapter, God willing, Bezos Hashem Yisbarach, in 7.5 years. We'll have this strength to study this beautiful chapter again, together. Hadranolach, Hashoel. Now we start the next chapter, which is called Hamikabel Sada Mechavero. The parak Hamikabel Sada Mechavero. So just as an introduction, the chapter is going to focus on different aspects of financial relationships, but the primary two things we need to know is that there's something called a person who's a makabel or a choker. So the makabel is the one who accepts the field as like a sharecropper, and so therefore the farmer who works the field, he says, I'm going to give you a percentage to the owner, either a half, a third, or a quarter. Whereas there is a choker, and the choker is basically like a renter, and he says, I'm going to give you a fixed amount, regardless of how much I produce, how much the land produces, and how much money I make. So let's say a person gets the field as a sharecropper. Malcolm Shinagul Lichtzor. So Lichtzor is the idea that you would cut down the rest of the crops that weren't harvested, but you just cut it down to the ground. So you leave a little stubble there. So a place where the understanding was that he does that. Yitzor, he just cuts it down. La'akar, a place where it's custom to uproot it. Ya'akor, he has to uproot it. La'achrosh acharav, a practice where the custom was that after the harvest or the uprooting, he had to uproot the roots, basically by plowing, and to take out all the roots, not just to uproot the crops, but to take out all the roots. Yachrosh has to do that. Everything follows the practice of the land. Just like they divide up the crops, so just like there's a sharecropper with respect to the crops, also with respect to the teven and the kash, these are different types of refuse that remains in the land and eventually becomes food for the animals or some sort of other thing that farmers would use it. So they also split that. Kashem shecholkim leyayin kacholkim bizmuros. Just like they split the wine, also they split the grape vines, ubakinim, and also the reeds, the uvakanim, and also like these like branches, the sticks that they were used to keep up the grapevines were on top of 103b. They also split that. Shneim misapkin is the kanim. Both of them have to provide for these pieces of wood that were used to hold up the grapevines. So we say Tana Makom Shenagu Liktzor Eino Rishaylak, or a place where it's accustomed to cut it down, they're not allowed to uproot it. La'akor, place where it's practiced to uproot it, Eino Rishaylak, or they're not allowed to just cut it down. Which name Akvin that both parties could prevent the other one from doing it if they don't want it. Al Liktzor Eino Rishaylak, or if the practice was to cut it down, he can't rip it. He's not allowed to rip it out. Hi, Amar Ba'ina Ditevin li Arai, because this one could say, I want the owner of the land could say, I want that the extra crops remain in the ground, so I won't have to fertilize it next year. Hi, Amar Lo Matzina, and if the owner of the land wants him to uproot it, he could say, excuse me, and if the farmer doesn't if the owner of the land wants the farmer to uproot it and he doesn't want to do it, he could say, listen, it's extra work, I don't want to do it. If or if they both had if their practice was to uproot it, ain't no Rishayot, you can't force him to cut it down. Then the owner of the land could say, I want you to uproot it because I want my land to be clean. And or the farmer could say, I want the straw, I want the refuse. And both of them are able to prevent the other one from doing it. What's the reasoning? Matam kamar. No, the way you read the Mishnah is, what's the reasoning? Matam with tzorin or shai. What's the reason that if the practice is to cut it down, or it's not able to uproot it? Mishum because both of them have the ability to prevent each other from deviating from the practice of the land. The practice is where you force the guy to plow it out afterwards. He has to do that. Pshit isn't that obvious. No, Gemara says, so we're talking about a place where, typically speaking, they didn't weed, and this farmer went and weeded it out. So you might have thought the farmer's allowed to say, I'm going to hide in a kishna, the reason why I weeded it, because now I don't want to do the plowing. No, we say no, we say that he's able to he should have clarified, I'm doing it for this reason so that I don't have to plow. So the Gemara says, okay, I call Kaminag Hamadina. I call Asuyemai. What does it mean? Everything follows the custom of the land. It comes to include Hadatan Rabbanon, Makom Shenagu, Haskiri Lano, Sagabe Karka. So let's say you typically rent out a farm to the sharecropper, and in that place they would also include the fruit trees, which is a boon to the farmer because you don't have to do a lot of work, you just harvest the trees. So a place where that was the practice, maskirin, and they didn't specify, we assume that the fruit trees were rented. Malcolm Sheinago askir, a place where they don't typically rent it out, a maskirin, and we assume it wasn't included. Malcolm Sheinago askir maskirin, isn't that pshita? Isn't that obvious? Gemara says no. No, we're talking about a case where, generally speaking, the whole world says the sharecropper is going to get that the owner gets a third and the sharecropper gets 2/3. And in this case, the owner took less. He only got a quarter. Mao Zedong might have said, so you might have thought the owner could claim, well, the reason why I took less, because I wasn't giving you the trees. No, he had to be an explicit, otherwise we don't say you're making these deals amongst yourself and the other guy's bound by it. Malcolm Shenago Shalo Askir, a maskir, in a place where the practice was not to rent it out, we don't rent it out. Well, isn't that pshita? Isn't that obvious? The Gemara says no. The whole world accepts it for Generally speaking, the owner gets a quarter. In this case, the owner took a third. He might have said, the reason the sharecropper said the reason why I let you get a higher percentage was that's the obviously being lenos. I thought you were going to give me the trees. No, you have to have been explicit. You can't just basically good advice. If you're doing a contract, you have to spell everything out. Just like they divide up the crops, they also divide up the straw. Amarav Yosef, Bavel, Nihigu Yehivu Tivno Arisa. In Babylon, they had the practice that the sharecropper did not get the. In Babylon, they had the practice that the sharecropper did not get the hay, the straw. My nafkamina. The ika inish the yav ayin yafahu gamrina. Because we could say if there's a person who did it, it's just because he was being generous, and we can't learn out that that's the practice. So basically, if there's a custom, you follow the customs, and the fact that one person deviated, you can't learn from that. Amrav Yosef, Bukhra v'tafta v'arkavta v'kani dechizra de'balabayis. So now we're talking about the responsibilities. So let's say they used to put down like these markers to mark the borders of the field. So they would put down like a pile of earth and a tafta, and then they would add on the second pile, Varkavta, the third pile, the Kani de Chizra, and they would put up these posts around the field in order to eventually make a fence around them. All of this is the responsibility of the owner of the field. The Chizra, Gufa de Arisa. But then if they wanted to make the actual fence, which is extra, that's to protect the crops, not to just mark it, that's the responsibility of the sharecropper. Called the Milsa, called Ikar Balma, the Balabayas. Turasi Sarah Darisa, anything that was from the main aspect of the field, that's the owner's, that's the Balabayas. But anything extra, that's the sharecropper's responsibility. Amar of Yosef, Mara, Uzavila, Vidavla, Vizarnuka, the Balabayas. That the hoe and the shovel, like the tools, and the water, the bucket to water the field, and the zarnuka, this was like something that they used to fill up the water to water the field. All of this is the balabayas, or the owner of the field responsibility. But if you wanted to make a like these little ditches to help draw the water out and make it more convenient for the sharecropper, that was the sharecropper's responsibility. Kashem shacholkim b'yayin kacholkim is marsukanim. Just like they split the wine, they also split the branches of the grapevines and also the posts. So the Gemara says, the Gemara assumes at first that when the Gemara says that they split the coat, that they have to both provide the posts, kanim may have a detail. Meaning to say, why do we need posts in the vineyards? Amr Debei Biyana, we're talking about Kanam Hamilchakin, Shebahem Midin Esegafanim. We're talking about these peeled posts, and their responsibility was to keep it standing. Because the Gemara first was asking the question that the Gemara first assumed that they were talking about the kinim, like these bamboo shoots that were growing in the vineyard. So we say, what do you mean? What are they doing in the vineyard? So now I say, no, that the point is we're talking about the stuff you bring in to keep up the grapevines. Shneim esapkin esakanim, and both of them have to provide it, lamali. Meaning to say, why does the Mishnah have to tell us this? So since the sharecropper and the owner obviously split it, so for sure they had the partnership from the beginning. So the Gemara says, yeah, but it's matam kamar. What's the reason why they both split it? They share it. Matam shneim cholkim mekanim. What's the reason why they both share in it? Mishum teshneim esapkin esakanim. Because both of them provide it. So since both of them provide it, therefore they both have to. Therefore they split it. So the next Mishnah says, "Hamekabel sada michavero, v'hi beis hashlachin." So let's say a person gets a field And we're going to see later on from our Gemara that here we're talking about either as a sharecropper or as a renter. And this field is a dry field that it needs to be irrigated from a spring. And it can't be just, it's not going to rely upon rain. Oh, Besa Elon. Or the field is a Besa Elon, means say there's fruit trees growing in it. Yavish Amayan V'niktas Elon. Let's say the spring dries up, so there was a spring in the field, or the tree gets cut down. Eino Menakelo Min Chakuro. The sharecropper is not, or the tenant is not allowed to deduct his rent, even though he claims that he wouldn't have wanted this field, that the only reason why he wanted this field was because of the spring or the tree in it. Since he didn't put it explicitly, he's out of luck. But in Amarlo, but if he said, Chakroi Sada Beis Hashachan Zu, or Sada Beis Elon Zu, but if he says, rent out for me this specific field, or he says, rent out this specific orchard, but then if it dries up or if it gets cut off, then he can deduct from the rent, because he said from the beginning that he clearly wants it. The Mishnah's assumption is that he really had wanted it only, for that language, he had wanted it only because of that spring or the tree that was in it. So the Gemara says, Hey, which spring dried up? If we're talking about a case that a large river dried up all around him, why is the sharecropper not able to deduct from the amount he has to pay? Why can't he say this is like a natural disaster? And we were going to learn later on that if there's a natural disaster, that he can pay less money. Amar Papa, the Yavish Narazuta. And we're talking about where the small river that was just in that person's field dried up. The Amar way that the owner could say, you could have carried it up by a bucket. And Amar Papa, Hani Tarti Masnisa Kamai. So these two Mishnayos, Mishkachas Labein Bechakru Nasa. So the first two Mishnayos of the chapter, they can apply either by the sharecropper or by the just straight up tenant. But from this point on, the Isa B'Kablanusa, Isa B'Chakranusa, the Isa B'Chakranusa, Isa B'Kablanusa. From this point on, those Mishnayos that deal with a sharecropper are not dealing with a tenant, and vice versa. Okay, we'll stop here, and everything should go well today at the bris. Everybody should have a shmak day. Shekoyach. Thank you.